Hello, class. From time to time, I'm going to do some video lectures for state and local government just to clarify some material and to add a bit of material that may not be in the textbook. So this will be our first of those. We're going to be into Module 2. You're going to be reading 1 and 2 in your textbook. And remember, you got to do the chapter quizzes. There's a link to do those in What's Due When, and that link will be in every What's Due When. So get this textbook. You've got to read the first 2 chapters and do those chapter quizzes. Now, what I want to talk about today that's not in your textbook is a little bit about why state and local government is so important to us and some of the policy responsibilities that state and local governments have. Now, first of all, to me, what I like to call this class, and I've taught this class for 20 years now. I usually teach it every semester at SUNY Plattsburgh. I've taught it off and on campus and every semester online at Clinton Community College. And it's one of my favorite classes to teach, especially in the classroom, because I have the ability to bring in numerous guest speakers like former Assemblywoman Jan Dupre, who's a friend of mine, Billy Jones, County Legislator Chris Rosenquist, Town of Plattsburgh Supervisor Michael Cashman, and others. But we won't be able to do that, obviously, in the online format. But I still want to talk to you a little bit about, first of all today, why state and local government, they're the most important governments in your lives. And I like to refer to them in this class as practical government, because state and local governments have much more impact on your life than the federal government ever will. And really, when you think about it, the federal government, with the president and the House and the Senate and the Supreme Court, they're almost like an imaginary government. We watch them on TV, but we really have no contact with them unless you go on a tour of Washington, D.C., and then you just see the sights. Chances are, if you meet any president in your lifetime, that's something you'll brag about. I've never personally met a president. I don't know if I ever will, and quite frankly, I really don't care. But with state and local officials, you're going to get to meet these people. Even the state officials. Our Assemblyman, Billy Jones, I've come to know pretty well. My daughter works for him. He came to our class in the fall at Plattsburgh State. Jan Dupre, our former Assemblywoman, I'm proud to say she's my friend. I've met Governor Cuomo on 2 different occasions, talked to him, shook his hand. I met former Governor Pataki before and chatted with him. I know many of the county legislators. I've known all the mayors of Plattsburgh, including the current Mayor Colin Reed, Jim Kelnan, Donnie Kasperzak, Danny Stewart. I've known them all. And part of it is we're lucky. We live in a rural community where you're really going to have contact with the local elected officials. And when you enter your professional careers, you're just going to end up meeting these people and getting to know some of them. And the great part of it is we can have impact on it. You can contact them, call them up, talk to them, and they'll talk to you because they truly care about their community. So later on, when we get into the actual workings of the government of the county and the city, I'll direct you to websites to look at and give you more examples of this, especially at the local level. Now, what I want to talk to you about next is some of the policy responsibilities that state and local governments have that provide us with things that we take for granted on a daily basis. So just generally speaking, what I'm talking about here is If you live in a municipality that provides you with water, like the city of Plattsburgh or the village of Champlain or Rouse's Point have municipal water systems, when you turn on the tap in your house, you've got the confidence that that water, you can put a glass under that tap and drink it, and it's not going to harm you. You just take that for granted. You don't even think about it. You flush your toilet and you don't worry about it. It goes to the sewage treatment plant. You wake up in the morning and you automatically assume in the wintertime, your street's going to be plowed because a state or local government does that for you. There are just so many things we take for granted on a daily basis that are provided to us by our state and local governments, not the federal government. So, when looking at the policy responsibilities of state and local governments, if we do this sort of in order of cost, the most costly responsibility that state and local governments, and it's a little bit different in the state of New York, I'll explain this in a second, is education, both K through 12 and higher ed. Because of the system we live in, the state of New York and your local school district is required to provide you with a public education K through 12. And you just take that for granted. Now, in the state of New York, the majority of that is paid for by the state through the state budget and state funding. The other portion of it, which is probably, I would guess, I was just reading a school budget today and I should have paid attention, approximately 20%, I would guess, is paid for through property taxes. So the overwhelming majority is paid for by the state. Local property taxpayers pay their share, and obviously, but it's in small comparison to what the state pays. And we just take for granted that our kids can go to school, they'll get a quality education. You can make sure they do by attending school board meetings or running and becoming a member of your local school board, being involved in your schools, communities. And then also with higher education, that's a responsibility of states and local governments, especially in the case of the college you attend, Clinton Community College. Clinton Community College receives its funding from three sources. The state of New York pays roughly 28% of the cost to go to Clinton Community College. Clinton County pays roughly 37% of that cost. And then the remaining cost is paid by you through tuition. So that's the funding formula for a community college, which is sort of a joint effort between the state and the county. And then if you go on, let's say, to SUNY Plattsburgh or another SUNY four-year school to complete your bachelor's degree, it's totally funded by the state of New York and your tuition dollars. So that's a public education at the higher level. You have to chip in and pay for part of it yourselves, except for, of course, with the brand new Excelsior scholarship, the state of New York, if your parents, I believe the income level for this coming year is $125,000. If your parents make less than $125,000, you can apply for an Excelsior scholarship and the state of New York will pay all your tuition. So there's even cases where the state steps up and pays for that. Those of you who haven't looked into that, you should for the fall. You might qualify, and then it will cost you a dime to go to Clinton Community College, and you can save your money for later education. So, That's a big responsibility. And to give you an idea of the cost breakdown, state and local governments spend 90% of the cost of all public education. The federal government chips in here and there, but all it amounts to is 10% of the cost. Even though they try to stick their noses in and manipulate what goes on for just 10% of the cost with programs that we'll talk about later on in class, such as No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top. Those are becoming more and more apparently failures, as many of you know who have been subjected to Common Core. That came down through the federal government, and it's being rejected across the nation, and from what I understand, slowly but surely phased out. So, the next big policy responsibility of state and local governments is what we'll call health and welfare, which involves providing health care to those who can't afford it through a program known as Medicaid. Now, I want to make sure you know the difference between these two. Medicaid is medical benefits for people who meet income levels and are eligible, or they can pay part of it themselves through the Affordable Care Act. And the other program, which gets confused with Medicaid, is Medicare. Medicare is health care for senior citizens. After you turn 65, you're eligible for Medicare, but you've been paying for it your entire lives. They take that Medicare deduction out of your paycheck, as many of you are very aware of. So, that's part of the formula of health and welfare for citizens. Other parts come in the form of helping people who are struggling financially with such things as social service benefits to help them with housing, food stamps, or as it's commonly called now, SNAP, to help people have enough to eat. And this really even boils down to something that's very prevalent today. That's unemployment. And the state pays a portion of those unemployment benefits you collect. But right now, due to the COVID-19 crisis and the CARE Act that was passed by Congress, a large portion of the unemployment benefits are being picked up by the federal government due to the crisis that we're in. But that's also a way to assist people when they lose their job for a whole host of reasons. This time, we obviously know the reason. And that's part of health and welfare, social services, and income maintenance. Now, another area that is pretty costly to state and local governments is the area of transportation. Now, I referred to this in passing when we talked about you just being accustomed to having the snow removed on your street in the morning so you can go to work. Now, transportation is a very expensive item in state and local budgets, especially here in the north, because we experience winter, which adds a tremendous amount of cost to transportation budgets of the state of New York, Clinton County, the city of Plattsburgh, the town you reside in, and so forth. Because unlike a southern state like Florida, they don't have to remove snow down there. They don't even own any snow plows, where obviously we have fleet after fleet after fleet. State, city, county, town snow plows. All expensive machines that have to be maintained and have to have personnel running them. On top of that, what makes winter so expensive is the fact that winter tears apart our roads. When snowplows go over roads, especially in the spring when the thaw cycle starts, those plow blades just rip apart our roads. To give you an example, the average life of an asphalt road in the north, like the North Country, is approximately 7.5 to 8 years before it needs to be resurfaced. In the South, in states like Florida, Georgia, Alabama, the average life of an asphalt road is 27 years before it needs to be resurfaced because they don't have snowplows. So it's a very costly thing up here winter, and it's something that southern states don't have to budget for, and they don't have to repair their roads as often. So, besides just roads, and one thing that I would point out, in the United States presently, if you look at all 50 states and add it together, there are 4 million miles of surface roads. And in many states, there are millions of miles of on-surface roads. Not so much the case here in New York. Practically all roads are surface, thanks to the Rockefeller administration a long time ago. And there are over 240 million registered vehicles. So, the next census is probably going to report we have a population of about 335 million people. There's 240 million registered vehicles in this country, which also state and local governments have to handle the registration, the licensing of drivers, making sure that they're qualified, and so forth. Then on top of all that, you have mass transportation, which I know is really not something we think about up here in the North Country. We do have a bus system, but very few people utilize it. But if you live down in New York City, chances are you don't own a car. You get around by mass transit, subways, trains, buses, and so forth. And you rely on it on a daily basis. A lot of this is being covered right now on what's going on, trying to make sure that the mass transit in New York City is safe to ride on with the COVID-19 pandemic. So, at least with transportation, the federal government chips in about 30% of the cost. And they do that through taxes. Every gallon of gasoline you purchase has a federal tax on it. And those tax dollars are devoted to transportation dollars and are distributed back to the states. You also pay state and local taxes on every gallon of gasoline you purchase, and that money is typically used to augment the transportation budgets of the state, cities, and counties. So, transportation's an expensive adventure by local governments. The next one I'll mention is public safety. And basically, the best way to think about the state and local role in public safety is think of the newer term that we use, first responders. First responders are typically always either city, county, or state employees. They're not federal employees. What I'm talking about, obviously, are police officers. In the state of New York, obviously, we have a very large and highly qualified state police force that takes on a lot of different jurisdictions, especially in rural areas. In Clinton County, we have the Clinton County Sheriff's Department. And then if you live in the city of Plattsburgh, you have the City of Plattsburgh Police. If you go to SUNY Plattsburgh, you have the University Police. All these are state and local employees. And then on top of that, firefighters. In the city of Plattsburgh, we have a full-time fire department paid for by City of Plattsburgh dollars. In the locales, we have volunteer fire departments, but they're paid for by us taxpayers with a fire tax in every fire district you live in. And we also have EMTs who work for either the county or the town, or in some cases, the state. So all these first responders are state and local employees that we depend upon for our public safety. And then also, another thing you have to consider in the public safety equation that state and local governments pay for is the corrections system. Now, in New York State, we have the New York State's corrections systems. Many of you may be keenly aware of it, as you may have family members who are corrections officers or other employees for the New York State Department of Corrections, which obviously is a big employer in the North Country. And corrections officers and the other related employees play a very, very important role in our society. And one thing that you should be, a couple things to be aware of on this front. A lot of you probably aren't aware to how expensive it is to keep a convicted criminal behind bars. In the state of New York, in a state facility, it costs approximately $62,000 a year to keep someone in a state penitentiary. That's building the building, the maintenance on it, paying the staff, and so forth. It's a little less expensive at the county level. We do have a county jail in Clinton County. But another thing you need to be keenly aware of, back to our theme of all this falls on the shoulders of state and local governments, 90% of all people that are incarcerated in the United States are incarcerated either in state prisons or local jails. Only 10% of all prisoners are in federal jails. You have to commit a federal crime to go to a federal jail, and there aren't many of them because typically people violate state or local laws. So another very expensive proposition for state and local governments. The next one I would talk about is civil rights. It's up to state and local governments to make sure that the civil rights guaranteed to us in the Bill of Rights and the U.S. Constitution are implemented properly at the local level. There are no federal civil rights police out there making sure this happens. That's all up to local officials, government officials, and so forth. And I know right now, we're in a crisis, not just the COVID-19 crisis, but the civil rights crisis associated with the Floyd murder in Minnesota, where those police officers, unfortunately, didn't follow what they were trained to do if they were properly trained. And all hell's breaking loose in the United States, but obviously, you can follow this for yourself. And from what I was watching today, there's outsiders going into Minneapolis, St. Paul. Everybody that was arrested in St. Paul yesterday were not residents of the city of St. Paul. I'm not sure why they're doing this. They're looking at this as an opportunity to steal and burn or do whatever, but it's got to stop, and it's going to stop tonight. You'll see the full National Guard has been utilized by the governor of Minnesota, and the regular citizens are telling everyone, stay home, obey the curfew, let the National Guard and state police arrest these wingnuts who are out there violating the law for their own purposes. So it'll be interesting to see what materializes tonight. But I'm straying off the topic, but that's current events. That's what we're going to talk about too. But Mr. Floyd's civil rights were violated. There's no doubt about it, and people are upset about it. And the governor of Minnesota is stepping forward, and he's going to do something about it. And the mayor of Minneapolis did something immediately when he fired those 4 police officers who were responsible. One's been charged so far. The other 3 will be charged with accessory to murder or whatever. So, civil rights need to be maintained and upheld by state and local officials, as we're seeing across the nation. The next thing that we want to cover, as far as policy responsibility, is the fiscal environment. Now, I hinted around at that right in the beginning when I talked about when you turn your water tap on in a municipal system, you can put a glass under it and drink that water. That's part of the fiscal environment. Many municipalities have water systems, sewer systems, but it's also a state issue. Every single state has an agency that oversees the environment in that particular state. And that, in the state of New York, is known as the Department of Environmental Conservation, or the DEC. They set their own standards for air quality, water quality, and so forth, and manage the environment in the state of New York. Our standards can be higher than the federal EPA standards in the state of New York. That's up to us and our governmental officials. So if we want a cleaner environment here, it's up to us. They also have to manage our state lands, like the Adirondack Park, our state parks. They have to keep an eye on the health of Lake Champlain. So the fiscal environment is very complex, obviously. It's more than just turn on your tap. It also involves something you take for granted. Typically, most of you, if you live in the city of Plattsburgh, they come and pick up your garbage. Well, it goes to the Clinton County landfill, and garbage is a big, big issue nationwide. And that's why in many states, such as the state of New York, to try to cut down on the volume of garbage, because nobody wants a landfill next to their home, we are very involved in recycling. In New York State, you basically can recycle everything. And with Casella, the operators of the Clinton County landfill, they even have that zero sort option now where they'll sort it for you even. Plus, we have water bottle law. We have other beverage bottle laws. And up until COVID-19, New York State also eliminated plastic bags at the grocery store. They've had to bring them back temporarily because of health concerns of spreading the virus. But once things return to normal, that bag ban will be back in force. So we make a real concerted effort here in New York State to manage the garbage problems. You go other states, and it's as if they're living in another century, especially in the South. Southern states don't recycle anything. They throw everything away. No returns on any bottles. You stay in a hotel in the South, unlike up here in New York, there's not separate recycling trash cans in your room, which is quite appalling to me, quite frankly, but to each their own. Now, finally, I've talked about all the different things state and local governments provide for us. Education, transportation, helping us out when things aren't going well, and with housing and food and unemployment, public safety, excuse me, in all the different forms. Maintaining our civil rights are guaranteed, and maintaining all the different facets of our physical environment. Also, falling into that, which I didn't mention, are parks. If you go to a park to play softball or whatever, that's owned by a local community, and they are the ones who maintain it. So, in order to do all these things, it costs a lot of money. And to do it, you have to have taxes. So that's another responsibility of state and local governments. They have to tax us to pay for all those things we take for granted because none of it's free. So, to give you an example, if you combine all 50 state budgets in America, we're looking at about $1.5 trillion being spent combining all 50 states. If you look at the federal budget, under normal circumstances, when we're not dealing with crisis and whatnot, the federal government spends more than $5 trillion a year. In my opinion, you get the biggest bang for the buck out of state and local governments. They're frugal, they aren't wasteful with their money, and they are very good at delivering the goods and services. So later on in class, we'll talk about taxes in more detail and whatnot. But that's all I have for today. I like to keep this to about 30 minutes or so, these video lectures, or you'll nod off or get bored or whatever. So thanks for listening to me today. Jump right in. Start talking about Chapter 1 and 2 in the discussion in Module 2 when it opens tomorrow on Sunday. This will be posted. And you can talk about what I told you today. If you want, I'll try to pose a few questions to get you rolling here because discussions are a big part of your grade. So get that textbook, get on there, start reading, discussing, and I'll see you soon with another lecture. Take care. Bye now.